launching the YouTube part. Hello, folks on the YouTube side. Geography faculty and graduate students, you do have the Zoom link for this too. If you want, you're welcome to hop on the Zoom link if you want more interactivity with Professor Montgomery or other colleagues. It's perfectly fine for you to stay on the YouTube side too. As usual, we're just trying to make it a little more lively and interactive for the department. We'll wait a few more minutes before we get started. And Mark, thank you so much for trying these, but I'll let you have your first few minutes of meditation before the talk.
Okay, yeah. Meditation is probably exactly the right thing. So I'll be right back then.
All right, we are at noon. I see a few folks on here on the Zoom side. Hello, good to see you. And I see 10 people on the YouTube side. I'm sure the number will go up soon. I'll do a few announcements before I get started so that folks have a chance to catch up. All right, welcome to another installment of Geography Colloquium. I am Morteza Karimzadeh, Assistant Professor of Geography. I chair the Colloquium Committee. Oh, I need to put myself on mute over the YouTube side. There you go. We were supposed to have a joint Earth seminar series talk hosted by Instar this Monday, but that was canceled due to the speaker's circumstances. So no colloquium next week. Instead, Instar would like all units to instead attend the March 15th talk, tentatively scheduled by Aisha Morris from NSF about creating a culture of inclusion for building a strong geoscience community. So that's in lieu of next week colloquium. No colloquium next week. We do come back on the 12th of March, Friday at noon as usual, with Dr. Latoya Eves of Department of Geography, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And the talk is titled Reckoning Epistemic Shifts, Insurgent Knowledge, and Spatial Futures. So that's 2 weeks from now. Again, no colloquium on Friday next week. And the Instar one was also canceled. I'll email you once the speaker confirms the time and the title of their talk hosted by Instar. With that, I also want to make a couple of logistical announcements. Again, geography faculty and graduate students, in the email of an announcement of this talk, you should have received the Zoom link. So you're welcome to hop on the Zoom side if you want more interactivity. The YouTube part works perfectly fine too. I'll monitor the chat in YouTube and read your questions. So whatever is your preference is just fine. For the folks who are watching through YouTube, you need to be signed in using your personal Gmail account, post your questions on the right. And feel free to cut across multiple chats because there's character limits. I'll just concatenate and read to our speaker. With all of that, it's great to have you all here. We are truly privileged to be having Dr. Mark Montgomery of the Department of Economics, Stony Brook University, New York. And he's also a dual appointment with the Poverty and Gender and Youth Program in Population Council, also based in New York City. The title of his talk is Understanding Urbanization in India, Insights from Jurisdictional and Land Cover Perspectives. Professor Montgomery, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Morteza. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to speak to such a diverse department. I've been quite impressed at reading through the faculty bios and the student interests, not only at your intellectual diversity, but also how well that diversity matches the topic that's in front of us, which with reference to India has to do with the kinds of information, the kinds of insights one can draw from land cover perspectives, which I think are very familiar to many of you. Possibly less familiar are what I called jurisdictional perspectives. And so I'll hope to make that distinction clear and to give you a sense of why it is that in India, the jurisdictional perspective, as it were, is currently, I believe it's fair to say, the dominant perspective. And I see no near-term prospect for that to change. And so I'd like to discuss that with you and offer some ideas there. I'm very open, however you like to ask questions. If a burning question comes to your mind, you can unmute yourself and just shout it out. Morteza is kindly monitoring some of the other media that we can ask questions over. Okay, so just to set this in a broad context, I think everyone in the department is I'm sure, aware that the concept of urban is not something on which one can get agreement even within a given discipline. It's contested everywhere. It's a kind of concept you can never fully grasp, sort of a quicksilver concept in a way. And I think it's especially interesting to consider both concepts and measures in the context of India. So if you don't know, here are a few basics about Indian urbanization from both the land cover and the jurisdictional perspective. So if you take the view, as officials in India do, that the urban population of the country is the population that lives in under urban governments, right? A kind of almost circular definition of urbanization. But according to those criteria, India is in the range of 27 to 32% urban as of 2011. That's the time of the last census. And the country, if you look at the changes, as we will, and it gets to the talk, that percentage is not changing very much. The country is certainly not rapidly urbanizing. So of course, we all know that the phrase rapidly urbanizing is uttered so often, those two words together, that they've essentially become one word, rapidly urbanizing, sort of like Joe Biden is one word. This is not a case of rapid urbanization, right? And part of that is the way that in which urban is understood and in fact quite deeply embedded in longstanding economic development strategies of the country and longstanding concerns that have to do with political economy. However, if we look at the situation according to what some people call statistical urban points of view, population density, contiguity, that sort of thing, then the percentages of urban, when considered in that way, are decidedly higher than they are in the jurisdictional range perspective. And so to some people, that suggests that India's conceptualization of urban is somehow flawed, that it is biased toward being too low in some ways. And so there's a lot of interest in a lot of quarters. In your own department, Stefan is working with Deborah Balg, myself, and some others on asking the question, if we bring statistical urban criteria to the case of India, what do we learn? What are the difficulties in this particular case? One difficulty I'll mention is that this is a country with high rural and high urban population density. And so some of the techniques, patch type algorithms that might work well in other contexts, here the outcomes are highly sensitive to to various tweaks in the algorithm and can produce wild swings in urban percentages. So it's a difficult case. So this is where we're going to go. I want to talk a little bit about these two perspectives in the context of India. Then I want to take you to the current status of a long-standing work in progress that a number of us have been engaged in for heading on 5 years, where we use actually public domain data for India to examine its urban demography. And I will say right at this juncture, for any graduate students who might be listening, all the data that you're about to see are in the public domain with one exception, the one exception being 2011 shapefile boundaries of cities and towns and villages. Everything else is public domain and available if you find yourself interested. Okay, so let's begin with fairly land perspective. Here we're focusing on Delhi and its region, which is sometimes called the National Capital Region. You can see over on the left, using the GHSL, Global Human Settlement Layer. I expect many of you have some experience with that version of land cover. It is a data set originating in Landsat imagery that goes back to 1975 and counts structures per grid cell, the grid cells being about 250 square meters. So seen in this way, the National Capital Region, Delhi and its surroundings, in 1975 is in the image on the far left. As you move to 1990 and then on to 2000, you can see, enormous expansion, both extensive and also intensive, as indicated by the brightness or level of structural density there. And so that is quite impressive, right? That's interesting to many of us. There's no doubt that land cover is bringing information, studies of land cover,
Mark, this is Mortaza.
Information.
I'm sorry for the interruption. Overall, the quality is okay, and we are following you, but once in a while, the robot mode kicks in. So I'm going to make a suggestion that if you don't mind, turn off your camera and we'll give that a shot. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mortaza. I appreciate that. Okay, so we've just seen that important changes in land cover in this part and likewise in other parts of India. But the question I would like to consider with you is what has happened with the people who live in or near these structures that we can remotely sense. And in particular, have those people experienced a transition in the governments that they live under, who oversee their lives? Has it in fact been the case that as land cover changes, as structures begin to fill more space, that the governments that oversee these land, these pieces of land, have made a transition from rural legal status to legally urban status. And I want to talk in a moment a bit about why that's an important question. But in terms of what we want land cover to include, it's land is also covered by governments in addition to physical entities, right? And that is, I think, a helpful way of thinking about land cover, even if it's not always the conventional perspective that people bring to the term. Okay, so why is it? Why should we be concerned with what seems like a bit of an old-fashioned way of conceptualizing urbanization, and in particular at the most local, the lowest tier of government, rural and urban local governments? Why should we be concerned from the geographic or economic point of view with these governments? I think the main point is that these governments have different kinds of authorities to act in the spaces that they oversee. They have different capacities for raising revenue, different claims, especially in India, on national level development funds. This is a huge issue in the country. And they also have different political voices, both at the state level, the intermediate level of government, and at the national level. Urban governments have a task that is qualitatively different, including the management of externalities that arise from the density of people and firms and so on. And rural governments may not possess the authority to act in a number of the spheres that urban governments can act in. Right? And so the main point here is that although it's fashionable, I suppose, today to prefer remotely sensed measures of land cover, something that people often think of as giving the true picture of what is going on in the country. Those images are often today being preferred to legal boundaries for the local governments. And the big point I hope I will make over the course of this talk is that both boundaries and land cover that spill across boundaries, they need to be seen together, right? They have much more, there's a synergy in trying to blend these two perspectives on things. Now in India, as you would probably imagine if you know the country, cases in which villages, legally rural, become one or the other kind of legal urban, those kinds of transitions are often quite contentious politically. And I would argue that is quite right. That's how things should be. Because this sort of transition speaks to the question for individuals and local level groups, what kind of government would be best at governing us? So there are fundamental issues here of identity, representation, and also power. So here's a little bit of an excerpt from a newspaper article about 11 or so years back, which was published because the government, local governments, had the idea that some 53 villages should be legally merged, along with some other municipal councils, which is a legally urban term, into a large municipal corporation. And the villagers pushed back on this notion, right? And they say in the third paragraph here that, they saw no benefits for themselves in making a transition into a new situation in which they'd be overseen by a municipal corporation, a large urban kind of government. The dwellings in the village are self-contained farmhouses that do not need anything what a local urban body could provide. Their ancestral land holdings would be taken over. There's fears that the village would be used as a kind of dumping ground for urban waste from elsewhere there. And so it's not uncommon that issues of transition become contentious and become litigated and argued about in the halls of government. All right, so what does the space of urban India, how can we think about this? This is, it's actually quite a complicated arrangement. And let me point out, this is only the urban side of space in India, right? So urban areas are divided into statutory towns. Those are legally urban entities with one form or another of urban government. Then there are two other possibilities for areas that have an urban character, relatively high density, non-agricultural employment, but whose governments are still rural. And these two are termed census towns, villages that are designated as a town for the purpose of an upcoming census, and outgrowths, which are areas of development outside statutory towns, but adjacent to them, that likewise have urban characteristics, but whose governments are actually legally rural. And so in India, and the literature focused on Indian urbanization, these two kinds of entities, census towns and outgrowths, are now getting a lot of attention. Beneath the legally urban statutory towns are municipalities. There are also some industrial areas that are designated as urban, and areas with a military history, cantonment boards, that's a third type. And there's some, if you're a real specialist, we would talk more about the differences here. But for the legally urban municipalities, there is a group of what are called town committees and other urban bodies that are mainly in the northeast of India that operate under a slightly different administrative structure. The idea being to preserve the distinctive cultures and autonomies of Northeast India. So there are really interesting books. If you're interested in indigenous populations, urbanization, and all that, there's some very interesting books on urbanization in Northeast India, Assam, places like that. And then under the municipalities and as a result of a particular constitutional amendment, which I want to talk about in a second, there are three general types: a large, medium, and small legally urban areas. So here's, I think, the reason that urban is so deeply embedded in India in economic development strategies and the political economy of the country. I think, to put your finger on the core reason, it has to do with the role of decentralization in the arrangement of governments. This can be traced back to 1993 in a constitutional amendment that meant to formalize a decentralized system of government, not just with respect to urban areas, but for the country as a whole, including rural areas. And decentralization in India and in many other countries where it's been taking place is meant to set up a level of government that is in some way close to the people, locally accountable, locally responsible, and so on. And the question is really how to get that to happen, right? What needs to be done in order to put into place and strengthen and make properly function a level of government of that kind. This is, by the way, not just urban, but also in rural. So almost everywhere decentralization is being attempted, it is a really complicated and difficult process. Where we are in India, to summarize this longish slide, we're at kind of a transition period in which the necessary authorities and so on have not yet been put into place at the lowest level of local urban governments and local rural governments. Many of the responsibilities still rest with the states, which in some cases are quite reluctant to pass them along to local areas. And so things are not moving smoothly in the way they would in an ideal situation. Okay. And this is the problem, the reason that India is experiencing hiccups and so forth in this transition is that to form a properly organized, decentralized system of government going from the national all the way down, you have to cope with the allocation to the right level of government of all sorts of functions and services, the allocation of legal authority that different tiers of governments need to act in their spaces. You've got to find ways of funding or sharing funds in the system, and the legal authority to raise revenues within the local space through taxes and so forth. You've got to have the staff who are able to manage at their level the revenue raising and functions that they're responsible for. And in a decentralized system, you also have to create conditions allowing the community to have its voice heard in the spaces that it lives in, the communities live in. All right. There's a further complication here in that in India, the national streams of funding are divided between urban and rural. They're organized so as to go to legally urban and legally rural communities. This kind of shoots and ladders sort of graph just gives you a bit of the 5-year plans and the histories with respect to urban national level development assistance. So it's been very complicated since independence. Really, urban concerns didn't attain a high priority until the mid-1980s, right? So in a way, they're still quite recent in the Indian scene. Right? So the separate streams of funding going to legally rural panchayats ultimately have been quite separate and not always well aligned with the streams of funding that go to local urban governments, legally rural, legally urban governments. And one example that has drawn attention in India is a scheme that comes from the rural side, focused on census towns, so those which I mentioned previously, legally rural, but yet have urban-like conditions that would provide infrastructure funding while leaving census towns as legally speaking, as villages. So there's a bit of tension in the country about among economic development experts about the wisdom of this sort of arrangement. Okay, and finally, just to close off this part of the discussion, like in most countries where decentralization is underway, there are many difficulties. There's often a view that, of course, villages will need a lot of external assistance in order to participate in a decentralized system of this kind. In India, starting from 1993, and the schemes that really kicked in around then, there were certainly hopes that local urban governments would be somehow better able to avail themselves of the new development funds and so on. It just didn't turn out that they were, especially smaller urban governments. They couldn't meet the technical standards for infrastructure projects. If they got funded, they often could not meet the operational on the ground targets, and often found that they simply could not raise their expected share of revenues, often quite modest. So it's been difficult, right? And this is, I think, fundamentally why the official urban percentages and changes in them in India have been so low and so slow to change. Right. So let me move now to the empirical work that this project has been doing. The focus of this part of our project is on the conditions under which communities make a legal transition or a transition so into a statutory town, or sort of like a transition that's sort of like that, conditions under which villages become census towns, a bit urban in character, possibly candidates for further promotion to become statutory towns, and likewise outgrowths. So here's a picture of the National Capital Region of Delhi, 2011. The land cover view is there on your left. And on the right, in these red blobs, are the new statutory towns, new census towns, and new outgrowths that emerged in the decade from 2001, the previous census, to 2011. So what I'd like to do now is to give you a bit of the empirical background, right? What we're aiming to do is to build statistical models, econometric models, that ultimately would help us understand why some rural villages make transitions of this kind and why others don't. And likewise, it would be interesting to know whether the conditions under which one statutory town becomes merged into another larger entity. So what I'll show you in the next couple of minutes is some preliminary work. I very much, given the expertise in this audience, I would very much welcome comments and suggestions for where to take this work. So the task in front of us, transitions in legal status, right? And that means, well, and our time window here is 2001, using materials from that census, 2011, using materials from that census, as well as related information. So what you really need to have to document it then, with luck, explain transitions, you need to know at the settlement level, by village, census town, statutory town, the whole range of possibilities. You need to know the legal status of each settlement in 2001. You need to know something about the social and economic compositions of settlements in 2001, and then likewise in 2011. Right? We are really fortunate that India has put into the public domain incredibly detailed census data for both of those census years on these two fronts. So that has been a massive enterprise, but everything that I'll show you in the next couple of minutes has come from public domain data sets deposited into the public domain by India's census authorities. A settlement here goes down to villages with as few as 10 people, right? We have tabulations of their social and economic composition, even for such tiny places as that. We also need to have spatial boundaries of the settlements in 2001 and 2011. 2001 was a long time ago, right? That's 20 years ago. And you know, to find the boundaries of villages, small towns, and large cities 20 years ago, that's difficult, right? And we have a set of shapefiles that are okay. They will never be perfect, but they're good enough in most states of the country to allow us to pursue these kinds of questions. The other thing that you need is some sort of a transition table. And remember, the number of settlements in India is 650,000 roughly. And so that's a lot of linkages that have to be made. We did have, before I talk about the transitions table, let me just first give you a snapshot of, at the time of the two censuses, how India's population was organized. All right. So in 2001, if we distinguish between villages, the legal urban statutory towns, as they're called, and then these two gray area census town outgrowths, you can see that back in 2001, 20 years ago, about 72% of the population lived in villages. 2.5% lived in one of these gray area units, census towns or outgrowths, around 25% in statutory towns. by 2011, so over that decade, the proportion in statutory towns, the legally urban level of government, hardly budged. Right? It went from 25.3 to 26.3% of India's population as a whole. That's not much change over a decade, right? And that's why I say India has not been rapidly urbanizing, as we so often hear. There is a lot of interest in the change at the census town level from 2 to 4.5% over the period. And it's precisely because, as we'll see, it's not clear what will become of these census towns, or the outgrowths for that matter, in the future. Will they go back to being rural villages? Will they progress to becoming legally urban, so that the people who live in these towns are under the kind of government that would seem to be appropriate, right, for the composition of the places? So if we're looking at census towns and outgrowths, that's in 2011, these two. So that is a total of about 59 urban needs, rural governments. And I think this must be a situation that one sees in many different kinds of countries. Some of you may know the geographer Terry McGee, worked on Indonesia, and long ago he was identifying areas of that country that seemed to somehow mix town and countryside, Desicota zones, as he called them. And I think census towns outgrowths are something of similar character. Right. Now, to orient you spatially, here's a picture of Tamil Nadu, Southeast India, in 2011. If you know the country, you'll see up here, Chennai, and then we have an inset, a close-up of that, a large city. That's the one you may remember suffered a catastrophic failure of its water supply system in 2019. I think it was June 2019. Here are the units that we're looking at. So these are not, so these are the legal boundaries of villages, the statutory town of Chennai and others, outgrowths in red, and the census towns in yellow. Right? So it's a very congested, complex space in which these three kinds of units coexist. In order to understand, starting in 2001, how a situation like we see for Chennai in 2011, how that came to be, we need the kinds of materials I was talking about before, and in particular, it would be very helpful to have a transitions table drawn up by government and statistical authorities using all the local knowledge that, of course, they possess. But what we have to work with is a deeply flawed official transitions table. Right? And so let me give you an idea of the problems that we have. Suppose in 2001, there was a statutory town and a village. And that village, over the course of the decade, became legally incorporated into that same statutory town as of 2011. India's transitions table, from the transitions table, you would never know that such a transition had been made. Right? The former village goes completely unmentioned in the official transitions table, so that's not good. Right? Another situation comes about where a group of villages in 2001 are banded together to become a new statutory town. Right? And weirdly, that new statutory town is also not mentioned in the transitions table. So to give you an example, here's the case of Panskura, a medium-sized legal urban place in 2011. It came from the joining up of villages whose 2001 boundaries you can see sketched here. And Panskura did not appear in the official table of transitions. I think because the table was simply not designed to incorporate these kinds of many villages to one city transition. And so our effort to reorganize the transitions table so that things of this kind are properly documented, that has been a very big effort. It's taken us several years, and we're still not quite done. We were lucky that there is another data set, data source called District Census Handbooks, in which some of the transitions that were left undocumented in the official table are documented. Right? So let me, this is not a complete source. It's been a very difficult source of data to use, but, and we spent a long time trying to make use of it. So but let me not dwell on those difficulties right now. Where we stand is that we can, although we're not quite done, as I mentioned, with fully documenting all this, we have a transitions table that we can put together that shows how often it's the case that a village in 2001 becomes a census town or an outgrowth or a statutory town, whether directly or by banding together with other villages. And likewise, how often these in limbo status places, census towns and outgrowths, how often they make a transition to become a statutory town with a proper, urban government. Now you can see that, not surprisingly, most villages stay villages over a 10-year period. Some do make interesting transitions. For census towns, most stay what they were, which is worrying, right? That means that the tension between their legal status and their socioeconomic urban-like composition was not resolved over the 2001 to 11 period. And much the same is true with outgrowths. So one message here is that whatever is going on with these two in limbo kinds of places, it is not being resolved over that 10-year period. Now let me give you a quick look at some empirical work, basic empirical work that is trying to find some social and economic structure in the likelihood of transitions. I'll start with outgrowths. So outgrowths, to remind you, are right on the edges, right on the borders of statutory towns. So if they're going to be incorporated in a statutory town, you pretty much know which town that must be. I looked first at non-agricultural employment percents for men. Most of these outgrowths are in the upper, 90% and above category. And even in this, least agricultural kind of unit, less than a quarter end up making a transition to officially, legally urban over that decade. Likewise, I looked at the population of the outgrowth, and they tend to be small units. Even in the largest, those are 10,000 population or more, only just over a quarter of the outgrowths were formally incorporated into the statutory town. You can take those two descriptive tables together and do a basic model and a logit model of the probability of transition. And you can see there is some structure to the transitions. But of course, the bigger message is, on the order of 3/4 of outgrowths don't change status over a full decade. We did the same sort of thing with census towns. And the uppermost category of non-agricultural employment, that accounts for around 3/4 of census towns. Well, 12% of such towns made a transition. It's not very common. Likewise with population, there's some structure evident that larger population census towns are a bit more likely to make a transition, but that's short of 1/3, even for the biggest such places. And again, there is this kind of structure that we see in the descriptive tables is preserved to an extent, right? In a logit model of transitions. So here's where the empirical part is coming to an end. This is sort of our current agenda. We've got a lot to do to enrich the models that you've just seen. But it's pretty clear that what we did with outgrowths, which lie next to a statutory town, census towns, the same techniques are not going to work for villages. Because just some villages are in remote areas, they have no chance of being merged into, the statutory town. They're not spatially, eligible, so to speak. Right? So our thinking is that for each village, like here, an index village in red, let's place a buffer around the boundaries of that village. And let's see if that buffer intersects a similar buffer for a statutory town. If it does intersect, then we say, well, this village is in principle in a position, a geographic position to potentially merge into a statutory town. If the village is so distant that its buffer doesn't intersect at all, then we can keep those villages that are not spatially eligible to join a statutory town out of the analysis. That's the thinking. And to give you an idea of what a situation might look like, is Kashmir, a deeply under pressure area at the moment. The blue polygons are 2001 boundaries of statutory towns. The red are the boundaries of villages that a decade later had in fact merged in to one or another of these statutory towns, whether into Ganderbal or Srinagar. The orange that I hope you can perceive are all the other villages. Right? And so clearly many villages are so far away from the candidate statutory towns that they're really not likely in any real sense to merge in. So we've got to figure out, well, if we take this approach, village buffer based, intersection based, we have a lot of questions that we would need to answer to carry this work forward. And I've just listed a few of the modeling and specification questions that we're going to have to answer. And so this part of the work is just underway. Many of you, I'm sure, have experience with similar sorts of problems, and I'm sure that I could, equally sure that I could learn a great deal from your experience. But this is where we stand. And as for next steps, one area that we thought might pay off, given our interest in legal transitions, would be somewhere we hoped that we would be able to find a cache of legal notices, which are always published somewhere. But even people who are real experts in this area just have given up with this route. It just doesn't seem to be possible. Even if you know where those notices should be, it's difficult now to find them. As just illustrated, we will be using spatial data not only to resolve the cases we've still got to figure out, but also in estimating appropriately formed transition models. And behind the scenes, which I haven't had a chance to talk much about it, there is much more social and economic data available for all the 650,000 2001 villages, as well as the 2011 villages. There is a massive amount in the public domain here. And so if you are interested in this particular case, please let us know. Talk to Stefan, talk to me. We would be happy to have conversations about, our hope is that after so many years of putting these materials together, that we and others will be able to make use of them. So let me end there, and I look forward to your questions and criticisms, which are always very helpful, I think. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm sure folks are clapping at home. We'll give you a round of applause when when we are ready to talk. This was a very interesting talk, and I'm sure it's cutting across many areas of expertise of folks in the department and beyond. Folks watching on YouTube, post your questions on the chat, please. Feel free to cut across multiple comments. I'll concatenate them together. Colleagues and our, I think we have students on the Zoom side too. If you're on the Zoom side, either post your question in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. I'll start with the first question that came in from on the YouTube side. Could Mark say, and this comes from Caitlin Ryan, could Mark say more about the process of improving the transition tables? How many people involved in doing this? Who are they? How much time and money is involved?
Yeah, that's a very good question. But if somebody ever offers you the possibility to form such a table for a big country, my advice is to say no, thank you. We think we have located all but about 10 to 15,000 villages in 2001, but not yet traced them to whatever it was that they became in 2011. So this is not so much a matter of money. It is a matter of, I think, local knowledge in some cases. We can certainly say with reasonably credible 2001 spatial boundaries, we can say, well, these villages were in this spatial unit in 2001. In 2011, that spatial unit covers some different kind of territory, and the village itself is no longer an entity according to the official records. So those are probably cases in which the village merged in to a statutory town. When that happens, by the way, the name of the village just is lost, right? At least in the official accounts. So it's really a matter of some focused, spatially oriented research that makes use, where possible, of local knowledge, right? So if it's not costly to do this, except of time, right? And so I think there are good prospects. We'll never track down all these cases, but there are good prospects of tracking most of them, I think.
Thank you, Mark. Folks on the Zoom side, any questions?
Hi, Morteza. Hi, Mark. This is Stefan.
Oh, hey, Stefan. Welcome.
Good to see you. Yeah, sorry, I was very late. I was in the defense, as you know. But I saw a few last slides, so I guess I have a flavor of what it all was about. I'm wondering, maybe you mentioned something at the beginning. Maybe it would be informative for people if you could talk a little bit about the role of this Indian data in comparison to other countries that we are trying to work with in a more comparative fashion, in context of, how does this play out with efforts, for example, from the JRC to develop these more consistent models of urban, what it means, and why the Indian data really are an exception, why they are so complex and difficult to handle.
Yes, well, so I'll speak on a comparative paper. Stefan and Deborah Balk are in the lead on that paper. I'm a third wheel or something of that kind. But the notion is to look at the United States, look at Mexico, and look at India, and try to understand whether, in fact, at least Stefan, this is my interpretation of the paper, so you can you may have your own view on that. But whether it is possible using remotely sensed data, the GHSL data in particular that we saw earlier in this presentation, whether it is indeed possible to devise a scheme by which these three very different countries, their levels of urbanization and so on, can be properly compared. And I should also mention, which I haven't so far, there is a new combination of data grounded on the GHSL called the degree of urbanization data, which is a European product that many of you may have heard about. Its scheme articulates a number of different types of both rural, transition, and urban areas. So that is also in the in this comparative paper that we're trying to finalize in there. So the main message of this presentation is that we should not lose sight of the kind of jurisdictional legal boundaries perspective on urbanization, while we enthusiastically pursue these what you could call land cover alternative perspectives. I think going forward on both fronts is very stimulating, right? And that's, I think it adds value when you look at both kinds of perspectives at the same time. And I think because legal boundaries are spaces within which certain types of governments are allowed to act, right, and not other governments, you cannot let them, you cannot set those kinds of boundaries to the side, right? That would be a mistake in my view. But it's also the case that you learn a lot from considering those boundaries in relation to the land cover data that point out where population is spilling into without being overseen by what we could think of as the appropriate kind of government for that massive population. So I don't know, Stefan, you might want to add.
Yeah, no, this is a really good response. That's exactly what I was wondering. You know, how these two perspectives are related to each other, and I see it the same way. You know, the land cover, remote sensing driven perspective is opening a lot of avenues, obviously, but at a very different level, right? And how far this can be used will further show as you know, there's more progress on global population data sets, on global land cover data sets, on these derivatives such as the degree of urbanization and so on. So there's more to come, and more valuable information as we move forward and have more, for example, points in time to better evaluate what kind of changes are at all observable, and then better understand how this actually intersects with this kind of research, where you really need to be local and understand jurisdictions and so on, legal transitions, etc. I totally agree. We should not lose sight of any of these data perspectives.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just say I did mention that India is a very tough case precisely because it's such a high population density environment. It's really putting a challenge in front of algorithms that attempt to create comparable categories of urbanization. So it might be that other similarly dense cases would also be extremely helpful in testing out algorithms and criteria, just as India has been.
Thank you, Mark and Stefan. Fernando has a question. Fernando Riasmena on the chat side. He says hi, and he's saying very interesting talk as usual. Mark, besides rich social and economic data, do you envision any possible political data you could exploit to get at the process of which places decide to become urban? And how might pressure and incentives from central cities or state governments may play a role? He's also pointing out to the fact that our colleague, Dr. Yafa Trulov, who's on maternal leave this semester, may also have good ideas on this.
Yeah, thank you, Fernando, and hi to you again. I think, you know, there have been, especially since 1993 in India, a number of these development funding schemes, some, the bulk really for rural areas, but also, you know, huge initiatives for urban areas. What I've yet to see is where, you know, the pilot efforts or actual programs, where have they ended up taking place, right? And I think that would be very interesting information, which I do not have myself. The other place to look at on the urban side is public finance data sets that indicate what kinds of revenue raising have been underway to support activities in small towns, larger towns, the largest cities. A lot of this is really about inadequacies in the abilities to raise revenue that have kept small urban places from being able to access the funds that they are in principle eligible to make use of. And that, again, that would be data that we don't have, but I'm sure there's quite an active, public finance community in India, and I'm sure there's a lot to be gained by even from large-scale case studies of that kind of issue. I don't know if there are similar concerns in Mexico, and I would be very interested in hearing about that.
Thank you, Mark. And Fernando will hear you with 20 seconds delay, so he may follow up. I have a few questions on the method side of things, being a methodologist, and really interesting talk, but I'll step out on a limb and ask a question not in my area of expertise. Who's doing this work? Because if I understand correctly, you are doing, at the end of the day, drawing lines and boundaries for jurisdictions. And changing the designation, let's say from rural to urban, and in a place such as India with such heavy, with a legacy of colonialism, how is it that folks from outside are involved in it, and how do you work with the locals? I understand that at least in the population council side, you have regional offices and work, have folks from that country. But I was very curious to hear about how those dynamics are navigated.
Yeah, it is. That's an excellent question, I think. We're lucky in a sense in that the Indian census authorities have put the data, we don't ourselves declare that a particular place is urban, legally urban or rural. The census data are released with that declaration in a variable, essentially. And so it would be impossible for us in New York and similar places to discern that kind of thing, but it's already coded in the data that are publicly available. What is not coded, and it is a continuing exasperation for us, are the spatial boundaries of these units, right? And so for 2001, we have shapefiles and so forth that were compiled by an academic group. And these are data that are stored at Season in Colombia, are accessible, so they're public domain. They don't cover the whole country, and they can be iffy in terms of whether they are really trustworthy boundaries. For 2011, the situation is even more exasperating in that good quality shapefile boundaries for the boundaries of these cities, towns, and villages have to be purchased, right, from a private firm in New Delhi. And so over the years, we've been able to get access to those data at a cost, right? And it's exasperating because, of course, the Great Survey of India draws up detailed maps of the entire country, including the boundaries that we're after. But those, for some reason, those publicly produced boundaries, you can see maps of them, but they're not in the public domain, right? And it's never been completely clear why that is the case. But it does seem to be changing, right? And there are several volunteer groups that are, over time, putting more and more of these Great Survey of India spatial files into the public domain. So I'm hopeful that that will also open up, because that's the one part of our data that we cannot redistribute. It's, under the terms of under which they were purchased.
Thank you, Mark. Fernando just followed up saying, not sure about this in Mexico, other than seeing how resources flow to munis. I believe that's municipalities. People use political party affiliation at local versus state versus federal, but that may miss other dynamics. Mark, thank you so much. Any last remarks, because we are at the top of the hour? Wanted to see if you have any other concluding remarks.
Only to say on my end that I would look forward to following up. Those of you who might be interested in similar issues, I'd be delighted to. Thank you so much for having me here. This is a really pleasurable and stimulating experience. So thanks.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. If you don't mind, stay on the Zoom call for a second after folks are gone. I need to check in with you on something. Folks, have a good Friday. The next week's seminar hosted by Instar is canceled. I'll follow up with the rescheduling of that. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks for Latoya Eve's seminar, Geography Colloquium on Reckoning Epistemic Shifts, Insertion Knowledge, and Spatial Futures. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.